The early months of 1945 did not mark the end of the war for Germany. They marked the beginning of its final desperate delusion. The vast, intricate machinery of the Third Reich, which had once rolled across Europe with terrifying efficiency, was now grinding to a desperate halt. The Western Front was collapsing under the weight of the Allied forces who had broken out of Normandy, and the Eastern Front was being brutally dismantled by the relentless advance of the Soviet Red Army, which was now dangerously close to the very heart of the fatherland. The professional corps of the Wehrmacht, the seasoned veterans, the armored divisions, the Luftwaffe pilots, had been systematically pulverized in the attrition warfare of the past 2 years, leaving behind a hollow shell of an army. The realization that the war was irrevocably lost did not lead to surrender. Instead, it fueled a fanatical drive for total, suicidal resistance, orchestrated from the very bunker where Adolf Hitler remained cloistered. It was in this catastrophic vacuum that the Nazi regime looked to its last, most easily manipulated human reserve, Germany's children. The foundation for this final act of depravity had been meticulously laid over a decade earlier. The Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend or HJ, was not merely a club. It was a state-sponsored paramilitary and ideological factory designed to mold the entire German generation into unquestioning cogs of the Nazi machine. From the age of 10, millions of German boys were immersed in a dogma that preached racial purity, absolute obedience to the Führer, and the glory of sacrificial death, Heldentod, for the Reich. They were taught physical fitness, basic military drills, and a virulent form of anti-Semitism, effectively turning them into political soldiers years before they were legally adults. By 1939, membership in the HJ had become mandatory, ensuring that by 1945 there was an entire generation of German boys whose identity was inextricably linked to the survival of the collapsing Nazi state. Their world was entirely framed by the ideology of battle and sacrifice. As the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, these boys began to be drafted into auxiliary roles. Initially, they served on the home front, working as anti-aircraft auxiliary crews, Flakhelfer, manning the guns that defended German cities against the ceaseless Allied bombing raids. While still under military command, these roles were ostensibly defensive and technical. However, as the Allies began to cross the German borders, the desperate high command, particularly Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's most fanatical loyalists, began to formalize the use of these children as frontline combat troops. The idea was not to win the war, but to inflict a maximum moral and physical toll on the Allied forces, buying time and fulfilling the insane drive for a total war, the ultimate institutionalization. Of this depravity came with the formation of the Volkssturm, People's Storm, in the autumn of 1944. Conceived as a national militia of last resort, the Volkssturm nominally comprised men aged 16 to 60 who were not already serving in the Wehrmacht. Yet as the pool of able-bodied men evaporated in the ceaseless fighting, the age restriction became a cynical fiction. In the final chaotic months of 1945, the lines blurred entirely. Boys as young as 15, 14, and even 12 years old were pulled directly from the Hitler Youth ranks and thrust into the Volkssturm, or attached directly to Wehrmacht and SS combat units. These children, driven by years of intense propaganda about the cruelty of the Soviet Untermenschen and the looming destruction of their homes, were perhaps the most fervent, if tragically inept, soldiers the regime could muster. Their fear of surrender was arguably greater than their fear of death. They were the tragic human collateral of Hitler's ultimate gamble, to fight to the last breath, regardless of the price paid by the innocent. This transition from dedicated political youth to cannon fodder was one of the most shocking and morally repulsive developments of the war's final phase, forcing Allied soldiers to confront an enemy that they could barely comprehend. The enemy they were now fighting was literally the future of the nation they were trying to defeat. The ethical and psychological burden this placed on the advancing Allied troops, particularly those from the United States and Britain, was immense. But it was nothing compared to the death sentence delivered to Germany's own sons. The stage was set for a series of horrific, localized battles where the main weapon of the crumbling Nazi regime was the indoctrinated fury and desperate courage of its children. The fanatical decision to throw children into the inferno of the front lines required not only psychological conditioning, but also a simple yet devastating weapon that could be mastered quickly by an untrained youth. That weapon was the Panzerfaust, the tank fist. The Panzerfaust was the perfect symbol of Germany's final, desperate phase of the war. It was a single-shot, disposable anti-tank launcher, simple to produce and even simpler to operate. It was essentially a tube with a massive, high-explosive-shaped charge warhead attached. The operator merely had to pull a safety pin, take aim, and press the firing lever. It required virtually no training in the traditional sense of military warfare. No need for complicated ballistics tables or synchronized maneuvers. Its simplicity meant that a boy who had spent his life playing war games with sticks and propaganda could, within hours, be transformed into a credible threat to the best armor the Allies possessed. The Nazi High Command, particularly under the supervision of Heinrich Himmler, who had been appointed commander-in-chief of the army group Vistula in the final months, saw the Panzerfaust as the perfect equalizer. Against the overwhelming numbers of Soviet T-34s and the heavier American Sherman tanks advancing across the German countryside, the Panzerfaust represented a last high-leverage defense. A single well-placed shot from a determined fanatical child soldier could knock out a tank, temporarily halt in advance, and shatter the confidence of the opposing crew. The strategic calculus was chillingly pragmatic. The disposable nature of the weapon mirrored the disposable nature of the child soldiers wielding it. These young combatants, often grouped into makeshift detachments of the Volkssturm or the Hitler Youth Field Divisions, were deployed in two key tactical roles, both relying entirely on ambush, camouflage, and suicidal courage, urban defense and ambush. In the fierce house-to-house fighting in cities like Loubain, Breslau, and ultimately Berlin, the children were ideal for hidden, static defense. Their small size allowed them to hide in rubble, sewers, and basement windows, places where adult soldiers could not conceal themselves as effectively. Their primary mission was to wait until an enemy tank or armored personnel carrier passed within the Panzerfaust's highly limited range, often less than 30 meters, and fire. This kind of ambush required immense patience and absolute conviction, traits instilled by years of Nazi indoctrination. Anti-tank suicide squads, some of the most fanatical boys, often those who had served longest in the HJ, were formed into JAG commandos, hunter squads. These were often suicide missions in all but name. Their task was to infiltrate enemy lines under the cover of darkness and seek out high-value targets. The ideology drilled into them was clear. If they could destroy one enemy tank, their death was a glorious victory for the Reich. They were fighting for the 1,000-year Reich against the Bolshevik hordes or the plutocratic capitalists an abstract enemy made. Concrete by the sound of approaching tank treads, the emotional and psychological impact of these encounters on the Allied soldiers was profound. To the Soviet veteran, hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, the child soldiers of the Hitler Youth were evidence of the enemy's ultimate depravity, often leading to a brutal lack of mercy. To the American and British soldiers, who were accustomed to fighting uniformed adult enemies in the West, confronting a 12-year-old boy armed with a Panzerfaust was a moral shock. They were fighting not just an army, but a poisoned society, a terrifying realization that the Nazi system had utterly corrupted an entire generation. In one famous, heartbreaking incident captured by newsreel cameras, a severely aged and trembling Adolf Hitler emerged from his bunker on March 20th, 1945, to decorate a handful of these young soldiers. including Alfred Czech, a 12-year-old boy. With the Iron Cross, the propaganda was clear. Germany's children were its saviors. Yet for Allied soldiers watching these images or encountering these boys in the ruins, the scene was a grotesque tableau of a regime sacrificing its own future for a lost cause. The Panzerfaust was thus not just a weapon. It was a psychological tool, a moral test, and a tragic marker of the Nazi regime's final, desperate and cruel endgame. By April 1945, the war had ceased to be a conflict of armies and had devolved into a gruesome test of wills in the ruins of the German capital. The advance of the Soviet Red Army was an unstoppable tide. Yet within the battered, crumbling shell of Berlin, the fanaticism of the remaining Nazi leadership ensured a defense that was both irrational and heartbreakingly brutal. This final claustrophobic battle became the central stage for the horrifying deployment of the Hitler Youth as frontline combatants. The psychological landscape of Berlin was defined by desperation. Joseph Goebbels, who had sworn loyalty to Hitler until the last moment, was instrumental in mobilizing every last resource for the defense, utilizing his propaganda machine to turn children into disposable martyrs. The official decree for the Volkssturm was now entirely ignored. Boys from the HJ were handed rifles and the dreaded Panzerfausts and were often attached to the hardened but decimated Waffen-SS units. These children, some barely tall enough to see over the firing sights of their rifles, were often the most fervent soldiers the Soviets encountered. They had been subjected to relentless, targeted indoctrination that framed the approaching Soviets as subhuman hordes bent on raping and destroying everything German, a lie that fueled their tragic courage. In the chic, rubble-strewn streets and subterranean tunnels of the city, the Hitler Youth were given the most dangerous task: anti-tank warfare. Their primary weapon, the Panzerfaust, was a terror weapon ideally suited for the close-quarters, street-fighting environment. A well-hidden boy could wait until a Soviet T-34 or IS-2 tank rolled past his hiding place, a destroyed cellar, a heap of bricks, or a section of sewer, and fire the projectile at the vulnerable side or rear of the tank. The success of these children was measured not in territory gained, but in the psychological shock inflicted. There are documented accounts from Soviet soldiers expressing utter disbelief and moral trauma at encountering these boy soldiers. A Soviet tank commander, having his vehicle suddenly crippled by a shot fired from a 12-year-old hiding in a cellar, experienced a profound cognitive dissonance. They were trained to fight hardened Nazis, not children. This moment of hesitation, this lapse in brutal discipline, was precisely what the Nazi leadership had intended. The child was expendable. The psychological blow to the advancing enemy was invaluable. The Battle of Berlin transformed the experience of these boys from mere drills into a gruesome reality. Thousands of them, estimates suggest upwards of 3,000 child soldiers, were active in Berlin, supported by many more teenagers in the Volkssturm, fought house to house. One poignant and historically documented moment captured the essence of this tragedy: the newsreel footage, filmed in late March 1945 outside Hitler's bunker, showing an aging, visibly trembling Führer personally inspecting and decorating a line of Hitler Youth soldiers, including the aforementioned Alfred Czech, a 12-year-old rewarded for rescuing wounded men. The image, later widely disseminated by Nazi propaganda, was meant to project unwavering national resolve. In retrospect, it became the iconic visual representation of the regime's cannibalistic desperation. Sacrificing its sons to postpone its own inevitable destruction, the Allies were forced to develop special tactics for dealing with this new, terrifying enemy. American and British troops, advancing from the West, often found themselves confronting pockets of teenage resistance armed with Panzerfausts. The orders were cold and clear. Any combatant posing a direct threat must be neutralized. Yet numerous veteran accounts reveal the devastating moral toll these orders took. Having to fire upon a clearly underage opponent, often one clad in an oversized uniform, was widely cited as one of the most emotionally scarring duties of the entire war. The children were not just soldiers, they were victims, and the moral ambiguity of killing them poisoned the Western Allies' sense of victory. The final collapse of Berlin was therefore not just a military victory for the Soviets. It was a psychological and moral defeat for the entire concept of civilized warfare, orchestrated by the nihilistic core of the Third Reich. As the final, desperate resistance of the Third Reich manifested in the forms of old men and children, the nature of the fighting shifted dramatically, imposing a severe and lasting moral burden upon the Allied, particularly the Western Allied soldiers. The professional American, British, and Canadian infantrymen were trained to fight an army. They were not trained to kill children. This unprecedented situation became a source of immediate trauma. Veterans' accounts from the Western Allied push into Germany and the Soviet advance into Berlin consistently reveal a sense of psychological horror when confronting these youngest combatants. The enemy no longer fit the mold of the uniformed adult fighting man. He was a terrified teenager, often clad in an ill-fitting uniform and clutching a single-shot Panzerfaust, his face betraying a mixture of ideological fervor and sheer, unadulterated fear. One recurring testimony from American veterans describes the sheer impossibility of the situation, engaging a clearly underage opponent who, driven by years of virulent indoctrination and the knowledge that surrender meant the destruction of his homeland, as the propaganda relentlessly stated, posed a legitimate, immediate threat. A boy, perhaps 12 or 13, armed with a Panzerfaust and concealed in the rubble, was a fatal danger to a Sherman tank and its crew. The orders were unambiguous: neutralize the threat. But the act of fulfilling that order was corrosive to the soldier's soul. One American veteran, reflecting decades later on the experience of encountering a German teenager with a weapon, confessed that it was the most difficult thing he did in the war, often openly weeping as he recounted having to fire upon a boy he guessed was only 12 years old. Another soldier recounted an incident where he was forced to hold a young German at gunpoint, desperately yelling for the terrified boy to drop his weapon, all the while thinking, "Oh my God, I'm going to have to shoot this kid. I don't want to shoot this kid." This pause, this moment of internal ethical conflict, was unknown in encounters with adult Wehrmacht or SS troops. The children had become a form of psychological warfare, an ethical booby trap deployed by the Nazi regime. For the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front, the reaction was often harsher, reflecting the unparalleled brutality of the German invasion. Soviet soldiers had witnessed 4 years of systematic atrocities against their own populace, including the murder of their own children. While many Soviet troops felt a grim recognition of the terror when encountering child soldiers, the USSR had also employed partisan children. The sight of German boys fighting fanatically often hardened their resolve, seeing it as the ultimate proof of the enemy's monstrousness. However, even here, records suggest that some Soviet commanders, recognizing the youth and coercion, attempted to pull the boys from the front lines and take them prisoner rather than execute them. The immediate shock of encountering these combatants forced Allied troops to develop on-the-spot informal protocols. Troops in the field began making immediate judgments based on the visual profile of the German defenders. If the enemy was clearly a young boy, the preferred, though not always possible, tactic was to use non-lethal force to force a surrender or to wait them out. But when faced with an active engagement, particularly from the deadly short-range Panzerfaust, the life of the Allied soldier or the integrity of his vehicle took absolute precedence. The long-term impact of these encounters lingered long after the armistice. Unlike memories of fighting professional soldiers, when the final shots echoed in the ruins of Berlin and the unconditional surrender of Germany was signed in May 1945, the vast machinery of war ground to a halt. Among the millions of prisoners, refugees, and displaced persons were thousands of former Hitler Youth and Volkssturm combatants, boys barely in their teens, clutching their iron crosses and their empty Panzerfaust tubes. They were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, and their presence presented the Allied occupation forces with a monumental, ethical, and logistical crisis, the denazification dilemma. The Allied powers, the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had agreed that German society had to be thoroughly purged of Nazi ideology. But how were they to treat children who had been subjected to 12 years of total, compulsory indoctrination? The majority of these boys, having joined the Jungvolk at age 10, had never known a world outside of the Nazi propaganda machine. Their worldview was shattered by the reality of defeat, which directly contradicted every lie they had been taught about Aryan superiority and the Reich's invincibility. For the young survivors, the end of the war was characterized by profound disillusionment and trauma. The total war promised them was a ruinous lie. The glorious Heldentot, hero's death they had been prepared for, had simply resulted in a futile mass grave. Many boys, upon being captured by American or British forces, simply cried, their fanaticism dissolving under the realization that their fight had been pointless and that the enemy they had been told were monsters were, in fact, professional soldiers grappling with the moral shock of fighting them. The question of their legal fate was complex. The Allied Control Council formally outlawed the Hitler Youth as a criminal organization. Yet most of the children were not held accountable for the political actions of the regime. The official approach was to treat them as delinquent victims rather than war criminals. A few older teenagers, 16-18, involved in proven atrocities or espionage were prosecuted, but the majority faced a softer yet psychologically devastating fate: re-education. The Allies established denazification and re-education programs intended to chemically cleanse the Nazi ideology from the minds of these young Germans. The approach varied across the zones. In the Western zones, US, UK, the focus was on re-socialization. Children were often placed in youth centers, given democratic literature, and exposed to materials, including films of the concentration camps, meant to shock them into confronting the reality of the atrocities committed in their name. The goal was to instill the values of tolerance, democracy, and individual conscience, replacing the Nazi ethos of sacrifice and blind obedience. In the Soviet zone, the process was more overtly political, leading to the formation of organizations like the Free German Youth, FDJ, which aimed to replace Nazi indoctrination with communist ideology, often utilizing the same strict organizational structures the boys were accustomed to. However, the psychological damage remained deep. The story of the Nazi child soldiers is not merely a footnote in the history of the Second World War. It is a permanent and searing indictment of the regime's final, catastrophic failure. Their ultimate fate, psychological devastation and enforced silence, left a deep, persistent scar on the German national psyche that would take generations to heal. The sacrifice of these boys and young men, armed with the simple, destructive Panzerfaust, served only to prolong the inevitable defeat by a matter of weeks and to guarantee the maximum civilian destruction in cities like Berlin. The cynicism of the Nazi high command was laid bare. They were willing to sacrifice the nation's future, its most malleable and ideologically pure generation, to ensure that their own death was delayed and their doctrine of total war was fulfilled. In the decades that followed, the testimony of these surviving child combatants, men like Alfred Czech, who received the Iron Cross from the Führer himself, provided crucial, first-hand accounts that stripped away any lingering myths about the nobility of the final defense. Their stories were characterized not by pride, but by a profound sense of betrayal. They had offered their lives, their idealism, and their obedience to a leader who, in the end, ordered them to die in a hopeless effort while he himself committed suicide in his bunker, refusing to witness the consequences of his own fanaticism. The moral legacy of these children transcends the battlefield. It stands as a chilling study of the power of totalitarian indoctrination. It serves as a reminder that the greatest victims of ideological warfare are often those whose minds are molded from infancy, convinced to fight with fanatical courage for a cause they cannot possibly fully comprehend. Their youth, their fervor, and their inevitable defeat made them the most tragic casualties of Hitler's doomed vision. Today, the images of the young boys in oversized uniforms, gazing bravely yet terrified into the camera, are universally recognized, symbols of the ultimate tragedy of the Second World War. They ensure that history does not forget the shocking moral ambiguity faced by the advancing Allied soldiers, who were compelled to fire upon the enemy's youngest and most vulnerable combatants. The history of the children of the Panzerfaust remains a critical component of understanding the century of war. It is a final, haunting lesson that when a political system descends into nihilism, it will not hesitate to consume its own. Their story is a powerful, necessary whisper from the ruins of Berlin, reminding the world of the true, unvarnished cost of total war and the burden of those who were forced to fight until the very last breath.